Whether your team is your family, your business, or your employees, staying connected is crucial. You can depend on the Cross Insurance family
Very good.
to provide the best insurance solutions for you. We've got your team protected. Visit crossagency.com today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Veronica Cho. I'm Deputy Managing Editor for Living Arts at the Boston Globe. And I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today. The Globe has been celebrating AAPI Heritage Month all this month in May and with various events. And I am just delighted to be here and have the chance to moderate this discussion today. It's a partnership between GlobeDocs, which is sponsored by Cross Insurance, GBH World Channel, the Boston Asian American Film Festival, and the Asian American Documentary Network. And we're going to focus today on Asian American filmmaking and films about Chinatown in particular. Our panel today is made up of three very talented filmmakers who are here to answer your questions and have a discussion about the films they made. I'm going to start off by introducing them. First, we have Kimberly Basford. She is the director and producer of My Chinatown with Aloha. I think you're going to see Kim now. Hi, Kim. If you screened the links that we sent over the weekend, you saw Kim's film. She combines her love for storytelling with her background in journalism to bring underrepresented stories from the Pacific to the world. She is currently in production on several feature-length and short documentaries, and previously directed and produced documentaries including Winning Girl in 2014, which was on the World Channel and part of Women Make Movies Java Films. Also Patsy Mink, ahead of the Majority in 2008 on PBS, and also Cheerleader, which was an HBO Family documentary educational resources film. She was the producer on 2 national PBS documentary series, and she's been supported by the Sundance Institute, CNN, PBS, the Fund for Investigative Journalism, Women in Film, and many, many others. So welcome, Kim. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Next, we have James Q. Chan. He is an Emmy-nominated producer and director based in San Francisco. And there's James. Welcome, James. Thank you for being with us. James produced and directed Chinatown Rising, and his recent producing credits also include Plague at the Golden Gate. We were just talking about how both these films are premiering this week at the same time. His other directing projects include Bloodline for KQED, the large format 360-degree circle vision films for Disney. And he also launched the doc series Chinatown Shorts. His film Forever Chinatown was an Emmy nominee and received multiple festival awards. It screened globally with American Film Showcase, where James serves as a filmmaker envoy. He received a certificate of honor from the Board of Supervisors for his work highlighting stories from the AAPI community. And he says his sensibilities for projects are shaped by his refugee and working class background, and also by his love for nature shows and memories of his mother's cooking. He is currently adapting Lawrence Yep's acclaimed Child of the Owl book into a narrative series set in San Francisco's Chinatown. He is also a 2021 YBCA 100 honoree and a member of the Directors Guild of America. Welcome, James. And finally, we have Lisa Mao. Lisa should see her here. Hi, Lisa, welcome. She's the director, writer, and co-producer of A Tale of Three Chinatowns. With a career in nonfiction television as a development executive and producer, she's responsible for the creation of launch of more than 500 hours of programming for channels, including History Channel, National Geographic Channel, HGTV, Animal Planet, Investigation Discovery, and Travel Channel. Her credits include Travel Channel's Man vs. Food Nation, Extreme Forensics on ID, and Deadly Shortcuts on Reels. In addition to her television work, she also wrote and produced the award-winning short documentary Through Chinatown's Eyes April 1968. She is committed to helping people share their stories to reveal the complex fabric of the human condition, and she lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and son. I think I forgot to say, Kim, you are in Hawaii right now. We were all envying your location. Thank you for being here from a very different time zone. These 3 films by Lisa, James, and Kimberly are all going to be shown this week on the PBS app and World, some of them starting tonight after the event. There's going to be a follow-up email from GlobeDocs after this that will send you some screening info. And then just a reminder, we really want to take your questions, so you please use the Q&A tool. I think I see some of you are already using it on the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the panelists as we chat this afternoon. And then before we get into questions, I just want to say on a personal note, I've been in Boston for 20 years, and Boston's Chinatown has really come to mean something to me. I moved here from DC, and a native of Boston's Chinatown, a woman named Helen Chin Schlichter, called me up and said, invited me to a banquet and introduced me to Boston's Chinatown community. And it was one of many events that she invited me to in Chinatown, mostly at the China Pearl restaurant, which some of you may know. She introduced me to it. I got a sense of Chinatown and what it meant to the people. There were many of the people at these events had grown up there. They have become sources for me. Some of them, it's led to story ideas that I've greatly valued in my career. And of course, the Globe has, over these years, been following how the pandemic has affected Boston's Chinatown. It was the neighborhood that felt the impact first because of misperceptions about COVID-19. So that brings us nicely to my first question for all of you, which is, all 3 of you released films about Chinatown this year. And I'm wondering if we could start off by each of you sort of telling us how that came about. How did you come to make these films? What was the process like for you? What inspired you to pick up that project? And maybe we can start with you, Kim.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for having me here. So I am a member of the Asian American Documentary Network, ADOC, and it's a wonderful group that supports, elevates, promotes Asian American filmmakers. And they put out a call for story ideas, really. This was back in April of last year, for stories about Asian American resilience during this time of sort of the pandemic, as well as the anti-Asian hate that was going on. And so they put out a call for entries, and they had a couple of different ideas, of stories they were looking for, but of course you could pitch anything. But one of the things in the list was historical perspectives on pandemics. And when I saw that, I immediately thought of the bubonic plague that had hit Hawaii back in 1899, 1900. And the reason I knew about it is that my great-grandfather in his autobiography wrote about the plague and about what happened then. And he had a business in Chinatown. He was a merchant, and he wrote about seeing his business burned to the ground. Because basically what happened was, the plague came and Chinatown, was quarantined. The first victims were in Chinatown, and they were sort of trying to contain it. And of course, sort of blaming the Chinese that were living there for the plague. So they quarantined, and as policy, they would burn the buildings of people who died of the plague. And of course, in one of these controlled burns, it burned out of control, and it basically razed Chinatown to the ground. And so my great-grandfather writes about this and seeing his market burn to the ground. And I thought this could be a really interesting story idea for this series, and also a way for me to sort of explore my own family's history and connection to Chinatown, because I'm now the 4th generation of my Chinese family in the islands. And I think a lot of people don't know that even Honolulu has a Chinatown. So it's also just really great way to just let people know about it, and also just for me to connect more with it, because even though my family has been here for 4 generations, I didn't grow up in Chinatown myself. So I was really interested in looking at it then and now. So what is happening today in Honolulu Chinatown during the COVID pandemic, and then again, like 123 years ago during my great-grandfather's times, and what are the parallels between these two situations? And, obviously the real theme was resilience in both cases. So anyways, that's sort of how the project came about. I pitched it in April, and I think it was greenlit in October. And so it was a pretty quick turnaround in terms of production. It is a short doc, it's 10 minutes. So, but still it was really quick. So basically we filmed in November, December, and we're editing, and the film premieres online tomorrow. So I hope you can all catch it on the World Channel YouTube page and PBS website. Oh, I think you might be muted.
James, could we hear from you next? You have 2 films.
Yes, it's great meeting you and Kimberly, because the film that I worked on all of last year is called Plague at the Golden Gate, and it begins in Honolulu. So I can't wait to see yours. This film, there's 2 films, but the first film is brought to me mainly through Center for Asian American Media, so CAM, recommended me as the producer and paired me up with Lee Shin Yu, who's the director of the Plague at the Golden Gate. And it started out, American Experience optioned the book. They came with funding, so that made it a lot easier to kind of make this film. We started doing research on the idea of the 3 books that were written about this gave us the blueprint to find our interviewers. We interviewed all 3 authors, and then it took us to 8 different cities, descendants of scientists that were tasked to eradicate plague. So the film starts in Honolulu, comes to San Francisco when it arrives in when it arrives to mainland for the first time in the history of the bubonic plague. This is the 3rd bubonic plague outbreak. And so over 100 years ago, and this outbreak of plague in 1900 San Francisco led to a hostile wave of like ignorance and greed and anti-Asian sentiments and distrust in federal authority and science. And so when we were looking at this, we're all like, we've been down this road before, right? And so it was history repeating itself. And for us, when we were diving into it further, we realized that every time there is this unknown disease that comes up, that surfaces, there's always this knee-jerk response to find a community to blame. And Chinatown, and the Chinese community has always been blamed for these unknown diseases, from smallpox to bubonic plague, all the way to present day COVID. So I said yes to the project immediately because it was fascinating, and also we were shut down, so there was nothing else to do. The second film is Chinatown Rising, and it documents an amazing community treasure. He's a human pillar of San Francisco Chinatown. His name's Harry Chuck. Harry, in the 1960s, took a class at San Francisco State University, a filmmaking class, and he got access to a 16mm camera. And he, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, he realized that there were a lot of young folks coming back to Chinatown, and they were coming back to serve their community. So he turned the camera on them and recorded these amazing, exquisite footage of kind of like the birth of the Asian American movement, community organizing in San Francisco Chinatown. And it was part of his thesis project. And the thesis project was when he was planning to submit it, his professor basically said, you know what, this looks amazing. You're not going to be able to finish this in this semester, but if you promise me that you will finish it one day, I will give you this master's degree. And 50 years later, he finishes the film with his son. That premieres on American Reframe on Thursday. Sorry, you're muted, Veronica.
Sorry, Lisa, that brings us to you.
Oh, yeah.
Your film.
Okay. Thanks for having me and featuring our film. So A Tale of Three Chinatowns looks at 3 different Chinatowns around the United States and their efforts to survive today. How did we come to this film? So about 7 years ago, I did a short film called Through Chinatown's Eyes, April 1968, that looked at DC's Chinatown during the DC riots that occurred right after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, in April 1968. That film was about this enclave, right? This ubiquitous neighborhood, one of which was in DC, that was basically, kind of in the crossfire of a lot of, this rioting. So we really wanted to preserve those experiences of those who were coming of age at the time in DC's Chinatown, and really just capture their experiences, these, second generation Chinese Americans who were experiencing this really very, serious moment in history. Obviously coming out of a scar, a wound that is very much a part of American history, right? So we screened that film, and many times people kept asking us what we were doing next. And gentrification and what is going on in DC's Chinatown currently felt like the next story to tell. So we started exploring the current state of DC's Chinatown. Now, in doing that, it felt like, wow, in my research, it felt like this is happening in many other Chinatowns where gentrification is occurring, things are changing. So it felt like, why don't we explore it? And let's not just look at it in a vacuum. What can we learn from other Chinatowns? And then for me, just like the number 3, came to me, and then the title, A Tale of Three Chinatowns. And that just seemed like a nice, number to, compare and contrast 3 different Chinatowns. Why Boston, DC, and Chicago? Well, DC it's a shell of itself. So really it felt like this is sort of a cautionary tale of what could happen to a Chinatown. One of our experts calls it a dead Chinatown. Chicago is quite the opposite. It was allowed to flourish for decades. And when I heard about this, I was like, wow, this sounds really interesting. I wonder what factors contributed to that growth. I was really impressed to hear that the community was trying to secure a public high school for their community. To me, that was really incredible. And then the third city is Boston. And, why Boston? It felt like activism was happening right now. Like, it's very heated. In recent times, within the last 10 years, it's felt like that Chinatown in particular has been trying to fight for its survival. There are several others that are trying to fight for their survival. I mean, San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, there are many, but for us, Boston just felt like the right city, the right neighborhood to focus on, because there's institutional development that's occurring, there's commercial development that's occurring, and just the history of its evolution in itself, where it's located, as well as the environmental racism that occurred there when the combat zone was placed there. So anyway, so that's really how we came to that film. It started out with DC's Chinatown, but then in looking into DC's Chinatown, it just led to these other two stories.
So I'm interested in things that you learned in making the films, that surprised you. I mean, obviously you did your research and you chose your topics, and you knew, I'm sure, a lot about these places before you started, but can any of you share things that you found out in the process of making the films that really, surprised you or contradicted what you had always understood to be, or, were just sort of aha moments for you? Does anyone have something like that to share?
Well, I can share that when I started, there was a book that was written about the plague in Honolulu, Chinatown back in 1899, 1900, and that's where I got a lot of information from. But Chinatown has always been multicultural, right? It's called Chinatown, but today it's full of a lot of other Asian immigrants, Vietnamese, Filipino, Laotian, whatnot. But I didn't realize at the time that I was looking at 1899, 1900, it was maybe about half Chinese and about a quarter Japanese and a quarter Native Hawaiian. So like that was sort of new to me, that it was multicultural back then too, and it continues today. So yeah, that was interesting to learn.
I would say for me, I learned so much. one thing that, that really was an important element of the three Chinatowns and how they sort of evolved was just the restrictive covenants that existed, back in our history. Laws that said only certain people can own property here or can live here. And I think uncovering that was a huge reminder of, I would say that discrimination that we don't see, it's not so overt. So that was a reminder. Secondly, what I thought was very interesting about Chicago, and again, to Kim's point about just how diverse these neighborhoods are within themselves. One thing that I thought was really interesting was the different business groups in Chicago's Chinatown. So you have like the Fujian group and then the Toisan group and how they operate differently. So that was fascinating as well.
I learned that working on the Plague film, that the Chinatown community has been labeled the medical menaces since the time of the gold rush all the way to present day. And that was just mind-blowing for me. And also how resilient our community is through that timeline.
Another question that occurred to me, we don't see, I've watched all your films this weekend actually, and I enjoyed them all and I learned so much from them. What were the hardest things for you about making them? Like, what were the challenges? Were there moments when you thought, this is not going to happen, or I'm not going to be able to get this thing I really want? I'm curious about this sort of behind the scenes things that were the most difficult about making these films. Anybody want to share?
Sure. I think the most difficult thing was making a film about a pandemic in the middle of a pandemic was a huge challenge, mainly because it was such a rich archival, it's an archival film. And so all these institutions were closed to us, all these NARA, DC NARA, one of the only institutions that gave us access to go through their material was the San Francisco Public Library. They have this incredible history center there. So that was one. And then crew members catching COVID. And so that was the plague at the Golden Gate. The challenges for the Chinatown Rising film was that we didn't have the backing of a fully funded film out of the gate. This was built by a grassroots campaign that we launched on Kickstarter, and the film with Harry Chuck, who is Reverend Harry Chuck, who is pivotal in this film, and it centers on him recording the community. He spent his whole entire life in Chinatown building community, building trust. So when it was time to pick up the phone, that trust was inherent. And everybody said, yes, you're making this film, you're finishing it. Yes, we will help you. And so when we put that out there and we put it on Kickstarter, within 5 days, the community came through and funded our first initial, the max on that time was, I think, $35,000. So within 5 days, we were able to raise $35,000, which launched us into pre-production and production.
Fantastic.
I would say for us, there were two things. One is my co-producer and I, Penny Lee, we self-funded this thing. Like, we just did it ourselves. We felt like it was a story that needed to be told, and so it was self-funded. We did get some donations from people, which was very helpful, but by and large, the majority is funded by ourselves. With that, we both had full-time jobs, had and still have full-time jobs. So doing the film on nights and weekends and like vacation time, that was really challenging, but we did it. I mean, it was like, just go, 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 right? And sure, we did some fundraising, but we didn't have time to try to get it together. So there's that. And then the other big challenge was just trimming. I mean, the editing, it's just so hard. I felt like this could have been 3 films or 3 3 different projects. So that, I think for us was the biggest challenge, was like what to cut. And I mean, for me, that, I mean, I know it's always a challenge, but I'm just, it was very tough for us.
For me, it was, I think the time length was a challenge, so mine was commissioned as part of a series of short documentaries, and we were told each film should be no more than 10 minutes. And of course, there's so many rich stories and facets about Chinatown here in Honolulu. And it was great because what they did was they, ADOC and the World Channel, they assigned mentors to each of the filmmakers who were making these shorts. And so I was working with Frida Lee Mock, who I had never met before, but I admire her work incredibly. And she was really great. She said at the beginning, she was like, you only have 10 minutes, and maybe think of this as like a haiku about Chinatown, right? Because you can't go into, initially I was thinking of like going into about the homeless problem and the crime that has been happening during COVID and all of these things. And of course, it's just too complicated to put into a 10-minute film. So, having her sort of advice and mentorship was really helpful to get it down to like a 10-minute film. And then the other challenge, and I think I was resisting this, when I originally pitched the story idea to ADOC and World, I said I was going to talk about my personal connection to Chinatown, but I think in the first cut, there's not much of me in there. And as you see each subsequent cut, I put more of myself in. So I didn't intend it necessarily. I'm not in it very much, but I narrate it. And I think that made it stronger. So, but there was that resistance a little bit of putting myself. I just wanted to tell the story of Chinatown and not like me and what, my thoughts on it. But yeah, so that was a process.
I'm interested in what you hope people will take from it. Are there particular messages that you hope people will see in your films and will learn from your films? I know that's a big question. Anybody want to tackle that? James, I'll pick on you.
Sure. The takeaway, I think, for both of the films is that from the bubonic plague era to the 1970s Chinatown during this, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, the takeaway is how resilient our community is. And when institutions that are set up to protect people and serve the people, when they fail us, like the community is who like have our backs, right? We have their backs. And I feel like that is true across the timeline. And for me, the takeaway would be that Chinatown is intimately interwoven in the history of the city that we are part of. From San Francisco, DC, Honolulu, yeah, we are intimately interwoven.
Lisa?
Yeah, to jump off of what James just said, agreed. I'd say that one of the takeaways is that Chinatowns they don't exist in a vacuum, and they all have their own nuances depending on where they are because of the environment that they are in. But I would say that for me, the takeaway that I would like people to have is activism and a voice. If you see something that you disagree with or you don't like, you need to speak up. You can't just sit there and hope that someone else is going to do the speaking for you. You need to get your hands dirty and get out there. I mean, I say this to filmmakers, or people who want to get into the business. I say, just go out there with your camera, start interviewing people, and just go. And so, yeah, with our film, that's the message that I want to get across, is that you have to be active. You need to, if they're not going to give you a seat at the table, you need to fight your way in and figure out some other way to get there. But I would say persistence is my message.
And I would just, piggyback. I love it. They said it so well. I mean, there's so many lessons in history, and also, you're not alone. So the community, when it can band together. I mean, I have a few characters in my film. It's only a 10-minute film, but one of my characters is a woman named Chulan Schubert Kwok, and she's sort of like the citizen activist of the Honolulu Chinatown community, and just sort of that agency, right? Like, you know, we can't control this pandemic that we're in, but we can control how we behave in it and how, if we reach out to others during it. And even a community like Chinatown, which is scapegoated and has been scapegoated throughout history, you know, people can band together. And I really liked seeing that happening in Honolulu Chinatown, and also demanding, you know, because there was like crime and homelessness was increasing during the pandemic or seemed much more visible, you know, they finally got, you know, the city to respond, and there's been more efforts now. And so I think that sense of what they both said, you know, like learning from history and then also, you know, getting involved is really important.
I'm also curious about whether people in the communities that you focused on have seen your films yet. Have you screened locally, and what kind of reaction have you gotten from the people who were in your films and who live in those communities? And if they haven't screened it yet, you know, when you were making it, did you get a sense of what they really wanted viewers to see and to know and to hear from this film, from your film?
I can respond to that. So first of all, the film is premiering tonight on the World Channel at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and then it'll be on GBH on Friday and Saturday and Sunday. Check your local listings. Also available on the PBS app. Sorry. But I would say that, so for us, it's interesting. I think that, you know, as we were interviewing people, of course, you know, people were like, oh, my story, you know, it's not important, but it is. You know, I kept encouraging people, you know, often interview subjects are reticent to share. But once they get going, it's like the floodgates have opened. And, you know, I would say that at the time, you know, people, I think after the interview, they felt like, oh, thank you for capturing that story from me. And then once they saw the film, so we actually did provide a couple of private screenings for the participants of the film. And, you know, it was overwhelming, just the gratitude that they had that we captured their voices. But, you know, I said to them, I said, thank you. I mean, you know, we just asked the questions and strung it together. It's really your experiences that are huge. So the response from, you know, those who have been in the film as well as in the community has been very positive. And I think, you know, just to give people a platform to be heard and to be seen, I mean, that's really been impactful.
Kim and James, have you had reactions or a sense when you were filming?
Well, my film premieres tomorrow online, but it's been in a couple of festivals, and I didn't have a chance to go to those festivals in person. So I don't know yet. But I think people were actually, when I was filming though, I think people were appreciative just of the interest, you know, of more than just like a news crew, because the news goes in and does, you know, stories on Chinatown all the time. But I think a little more in-depth look. And of course, mine's a short film, so they couldn't go super in depth. But yeah, it seemed appreciative. And yeah, I hope to be able to gather all the participants together to do an in-person screening sometime soon.
I want to give a special shout out to Chris Hastings, Liz Chang, Susan Chinson. This has been, just to see that there's a program dedicated, like this whole week and this month on World Channel, pulling focus on our community is incredible after like all these years of like violence, right? And so we've screened Chinatown Rising since it premiered opening night at CamFest. It was a standing ovation, just a sea of like beautiful Asian folks giving the film a standing ovation for like 5 minutes. It was incredible. And then to take it to like community screenings from then, and then now getting it into, it is part of the San Francisco Unified School District's curriculum.
Oh.
Like, this film is part of that now. And this, every screening that we've had in the community has been like young folks coming up to us by saying, where was this history? We didn't get this history in the textbook. And so now knowing that it's part of the system, it's amazing. Plague documentary will premiere tomorrow on American Experience. And we had a special little sneak preview about 2 weeks ago at CamFest. But again, deep thanks and gratitude to Chris Hastings and Liz and Susan Chinson. And you guys for hosting this today. Thank you so much.
You're here. Yeah, I echo everything James just said.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go to some, we have some questions coming in from attendees. So first is from Danita Callender. She says, I'm a library archives graduate student in Boston. And I'm curious to know how much of an impact your research in the library or archives shaped the direction of your film. And then what surprises did you encounter and use or not use in the film? Anybody want to start with that?
I can go jump in. The archives were not only were the institutions closed to us except for one location. A lot of archival access that we had, we were blessed because we had 3 descendants of our characters, great-grandchildren of the characters that we were profiling, with their family archives. It was a treasure trove to go through and film like the scientists' speakers and documents and reports. But also the surprising thing was that as a filmmaker here based in San Francisco, and Chinatown is my community, I serve my community through film. And so being able to just make a phone call and then having one community member connect me to another community member. And then out of the woodwork, Esther Chang came out and said, I've been doing research on the plague documentary for the last 10 years on my own because it's fascinating to me. Here's a binder.
Wow.
Take a look at it. And it was incredible to have these like friends of the project come along every step of the way. Same thing with Chinatown Rising. Like Chinatown Rising, we had an amazing, like Harry was the one that documented and preserved the history. So we're just thrilled that he didn't throw it away. He was all like, it was in his basement and he was like, thinking about like, yeah, you know what? It's just taking up space. But I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Anything to add, Lisa or Kim?
So we use the archives of I think it was the Asian American Historical Society of New England, which was right in the heart of Boston's Chinatown. We did use it for some photos and whatnot, but we did primarily get photos from those who we interviewed from their personal family archives.
For me, the historical thread in my film, I think all the photographs there are either from my family's archive or the Hawaii State Archives. And so that was a really great resource because they had all the photographs actually online. So you can just, go to the Hawaii State Archives website and look at the photos and find the ones that I used in the film. And I just was so grateful that it was all digitized online, so I didn't have to go down in person.
I will go to a question from Eleanor Hong. She says, so great to have filmmakers talk about their films. What do you think is a major challenge of keeping youth interested and connected to the Chinatowns? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Kimberly, you can go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, I was just, Yeah, I know. I think that is a challenge in Honolulu Chinatown as well. There are organizations, Chinese Chamber of Commerce and whatnot, and they often kind of talk about how like they don't have as many young people involved. I don't know. I think sometimes it's the nature, right? Like I'm fourth generation, so I didn't spend a lot of time in Chinatown growing up, other than Chinese New Year banquets. Even though my family still has property in Chinatown, and I would say from that point of view, as someone who was a youth and didn't feel as connected, I think it can start just with your family, and for me is like the more I learn about my family's connection and the stories we have, the more I connect to the place and want to go down there more. And I think, I don't know, like in my family we were not like a big storytelling family, so even like doing a lot of Chinese traditions growing up, I never knew what they meant. It's just like you do this thing and no one tells you like the significance of it. And so I think it's important within families to like communicate like why we do this and what the meaning is. And that it makes you more motivated to stay connected. So that's my thought. I don't know. I think James, you probably have something a little more interesting to share about that.
No, but I think that that's it. It's being able to share our stories. I think for our parents' generation and grandparents' generation, we've always been told not to overshare, not to talk about hard things and hard feelings, and just kind of gloss over emotional story arcs. So for me, I think there's something there about this intergenerational connection that needs to be explored. It's young folks today talking to their elders and having those conversations. There's something really powerful about validating stories. Like we validate our elders' stories, but we also need to validate the young folks' stories, right? And engage them on platforms that they have access to. So I asked my nephew who is in his early 20s and my nieces who are late teens, and I was like, so my film's coming out on PBS, and they're like, is it on YouTube? Is it right? So they need to be engaged in terms of like where they can see these films, and I think there's something that PBS does with the Learning Channel that's really great. So being able to kind of look at it from a lens of, yes, how do we document and tell our stories and preserve our stories, but then also like, what are the platforms to get these stories to them?
Yeah, and I would just like to add that I think another way is to, just to jump off of Kim and James's answers, it is to modernize the storytelling potentially. I mean, this younger generation, I'm so ancient. I feel like I just felt so ancient saying that, but this younger generation, there's so many other ways that they're getting storytelling. And I think that we need to lean into that, right? I know that in Chicago, and anyone who's from Chicago, like looking at this right now, watching this, like, I feel like they have like some kind of hip hop event that they do, which is cool, right? I mean, it's like a way to get young people into Chinatown. I thought that was really clever. And I just feel like, what else can we do with that? I feel like Hamilton brought, totally elevated and brought this history to a whole generation, new generation, worlds of people. It's like, how do we harness that type of diverse storytelling, in all storytelling? You're on mute.
We're almost at the end here. There's one question specifically for you, Kim. Shauna Chen is asking how you came to know about your great-grandfather's autobiography. Did you know about it before you made this film, and when did he write it?
Oh, yeah. So I knew about it before I made the film, and it was just a thing he mainly did for family or people who knew him. It was not like really publicly published. I don't know, but he wrote it on the occasion of his 81st birthday. So yeah, wanting to look back and figure out what words of wisdom he might have or that people could take from his life.
And maybe all of you will write your autobiographies when you're 80 and 81 about your lives. Thank you so much for being here today and talking about your films. We look forward to watching them. I'm sure everybody in the audience here. Do you want to maybe just quickly end by saying if you know when your film is showing? So Lisa, you said tonight is the first. James, yours is Thursday, is that right?
Tomorrow is Plague at the Golden Gate, Tuesday, and Chinatown Rising is Thursday, the 26th.
Okay.
America Reframed and American Experience.
And Kim?
And yeah, mine's digital. So mine drops tomorrow morning, I think East Coast time, on the World Channel's YouTube page, and I think on the PBS website as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, all of you again. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, audience, for coming and listening in and sharing your questions.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Yeah,
well.
thank you so much.
Thank you.